Every night at exactly 12:17, I hear it again. A prayer. But it ain't coming from no living soul.
I know it may sound crazy, but there's a kind of silence that weighs more heavily than sound. A dense silence that seems to watch you while everything around you remains still. It was within this kind of silence that I first heard someone praying. Coming from a place where no other voices should have existed, it wasn't an ordinary sound. It was whispered, hoarse, as if the speaker were trapped or exhausted, barely able to continue. And the most disturbing part, it happened every day. Exactly at 17 past midnight, always at the same second, never before, never after. I worked the night shift at an old cemetery in southern Louisiana, one of those places forgotten by time and the city. There wasn't much activity. Most of the graves were centuries old, some completely covered by roots, others unmarked. But plot 37, it was different. A stained marble structure set apart from the rest, isolated at the end of a dark lane. The cross atop it hadn't fallen. It was cracked right. Down the middle, tilted as if something invisible had tried to push it away. And that's where it all began. But to understand what I saw, first you need to know who I was before that. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like so you don't miss the next dark stories. At the time, I was trying to start over. I had just left behind a stifling life in New Orleans, where the noise of the city competed with the noise inside, in my head. I served 8 years. In the army, 3 of them abroad, and although many people think you return home in one piece, the truth is that no one returns the same. War molds you with cold hands, trains you to hear what no one notices, to sense danger even where there is only wind. When I was discharged, I needed silence, and I found this cemetery in rural Louisiana as a kind of cheap refuge, far from everything that reminded me of who I was. The place was called Peace Grove, but there was nothing peaceful about it. It was a vast field with over 3,000 graves, many so old they no longer appear in the city's digital records. The vegetation seemed to grow angrily, trees twisted around headstones, and tall grass swallowed up the paths as if trying to erase the trails of those who passed by. Some blocks were closed due to ground collapse, but among the older employees, stories circulated about bones reappearing out of nowhere, about graves shifting position on their own, all said with that nervous laugh typical of someone who tells jokes just to avoid facing the truth. I was hired to cover the night shift, which basically meant walking alone through the empty hallways, checking that no animals had invaded the lots, and keeping the files in order. It was a lonely job, but it was exactly what I was looking for. But during my first week, one thing kept recurring, and it wasn't a coincidence. Every night, at the same spot, the sound would reappear. Prayer. It came faintly, muffled, but charged with an urgency that made me stop in mid-step, as if something inside me recognized that lament, even without understanding what it was saying. And what made me most uneasy was the place where the sound was coming from. Always the same tomb. Number 37. But on that particular night, I heard something else, and that's when everything started to change. On the third night, I decided to check the tomb more closely. I'd already mapped out the timing. At 12:17 a.m. sharp, the whispering began. It wasn't loud, but there was something about the frequency of that sound that made your body freeze, even without understanding why. It didn't sound like a normal voice. It had a scratchy quality, as if the speaker's throat were raw. And yet, it sounded like a prayer. A kind of prayer you don't hear in churches, but in desperate confessions, the kind you make in the last minutes before death. I approached with flashlight in hand, but each step toward Tomb 37 seemed heavier than the last. The vegetation there, was denser, and the surrounding ground was damp, as if it rained only in that spot. When I stopped before the tombstone, the sound stopped. I returned the next night, and the night after that. Always at the same time, always the same reaction. The sound stopped as soon as I approached, as if it knew it was being watched. I tried recording with my cell phone. I positioned the device next to the marble stone and returned the next day to listen to the audio. Nothing. No noise, no whispers. Just the ambient sound of crickets and wind. I showed it to one of the maintenance supervisors, an older man who preferred to laugh rather than get involved. He listened to my story, lit a cigarette with a trembling hand and said, "If you want advice, there's something out there that prefers to be left alone. Listening is one thing, truly listening is another." It was then that I began having the dreams. In one of them, I walked among black stone tombs, and all the crosses were upside down. There was a constant whisper in the air, but it didn't come from outside. It vibrated inside my head, as if the bones of my skull were transmitting it directly to the center of my thoughts. I would wake at the same time the whisper began. 12:17 a.m. One morning, I woke up gasping and realized there was dry earth under my fingernails, even though I hadn't gotten out of bed. That's when I realized it wasn't just an obsession or a trick of the mind trying to fill the silence. Something, or someone, wanted me to hear, and the worst part is that I was beginning to understand what the voice was saying, but understanding alone wasn't enough. The tomb needed to be opened, and that morning I made a decision I could never undo. That night, the wind was completely still. Not a leaf stirred, not a single animal made a sound. The kind of silence that, if you pay attention, begins to press inward, as if something were about to break the world's normalcy. I grabbed the keys to the tool shed, where the old levers and hooks used to open graves were kept. It was already dawn. I hadn't asked for permission. It wouldn't have helped. This was no longer a work matter. It was personal. It was a kind of calling, something that no matter how hard I tried to resist, seemed to want me to discover what was inside. I arrived at Tomb 37 shortly after midnight. Before I could even touch the marble, the prayer began. It was no longer a whisper. It was as if someone were speaking directly from the other side of the stone, unafraid of being overheard. But what gave me chills wasn't the sound, it was the content. It was Latin, broken, fragmented phrases, but one of them kept repeating itself forcefully, "A saint under the earth, lest he rise again." My Latin was limited, but I recognized the words. The saint remains underground, so that evil may not rise again. The lid weighed more than I expected, but with effort, I managed to shift it just enough to see inside. And there, hunched over, sitting as if he'd accepted his fate as stone, was a man, alive, breathing. His skin was pale, almost bluish. His eyes were open but unfocused. His fingernails were stained with dried blood. And on the inner walls of the tomb, he had written hundreds of phrases with his own hand, all in Latin, all forming a kind of continuous prayer, a barrier made of sacred words to contain something. I tried to talk to him. I tried to ask his name, why he was there, what it all meant. But he didn't answer. He just stared at me, unblinking, as if time no longer mattered, until in a slow but firm voice, he said just one sentence, a single sentence that transformed my fear into complete paralysis. "If I leave, you won't live until dawn." I closed the lid with trembling hands, my body still in shock. The prayers ceased. I returned to the barracks and never set foot in that section of the cemetery again. The tomb was sealed with concrete days later, without official explanation. But they say that sometimes, even through the concrete, you can still hear it, faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper that pierces the earth. And if that already sounds strange, Wait until you hear what the other gravedigger discovered in Grave 58. Because inside, there was no one buried, but someone lived there and waited. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize everything I'd seen. I forced myself to believe it was a delusion, a psychological manifestation of someone who'd experienced trauma like so many others. I'd seen during my time on duty, I tried to convince myself it was some kind of bizarre encampment, that this man might be a homeless man with mental illness, someone who'd found shelter where no one would dare look. But, as much as I tried, there were things that didn't add up, things that logic couldn't cover, like the Latin phrases carved with nails into the interior walls, like the way the prayers stopped at the exact moment I approached, like the dreams that continued, now with images of his face, murmuring from inside my head as if the grave had infiltrated my bones. After that day, I requested a shift transfer. I switched from night to day, even though it meant less pay. The other gravediggers didn't ask questions. They just looked at me with the kind of expression you only see on someone who's had their faith crushed by something unnameable. No one else mentioned Grave 37. Officially, it was sealed due to structural erosion. But every now and then, I'd see older employees making the sign of the cross as they passed by. And sometimes, very rarely, I'd hear reports from visitors saying they'd felt something strange in that direction. A chill, a murmur, a strange emptiness. The most disturbing thing of all was realizing that even now, as the years pass, the number 00.17 still makes me glance at the clock without thinking, as if that time had been engraved in me, as if it were a constant reminder that it's still down there. And if that was hard to believe, what happened to Grave 58 will make you rethink everything you know about loneliness, sanity, and what it truly means to live among the dead. Because in that grave, what was buried wasn't flesh. It was a secret, and someone opened it. There are things we only see once, and even if we never tell anyone, they remain alive within us, like a scar that doesn't burn on the outside, but still throbs on the inside. I wasn't the type to be easily impressed. 32 years working in a cemetery teaches you to separate myth from truth, to ignore stories of lost souls, and to laugh at those legends the younger ones spread to pass the time on their late-night shifts. But what happened that week, to this day, makes me think twice. Before walking alone through the children's section of the municipal cemetery, it all started discreetly, small details you only notice when you've worked there for too long. A lollipop left on a grave, a teddy bear appearing out of nowhere, still wrapped in plastic on top of a headstone, a deflated balloon stuck to a crooked crucifix. At first, I thought it was some mother secretly visiting her son's grave, or maybe some neighborhood kid breaking in out of curiosity. But there was something strange. Everything always appeared early in the morning, before the gates even opened, and none of the security cameras showed any movement. But the most disturbing thing is that all these objects were being left in the same tomb, that of the girl named Julia. And now's when you need to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, because this story doesn't have a simple explanation, and after you hear it, you might understand why, to this day, no one wants to work the night shift near Tomb 108. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like so you don't miss the next dark stories. Julia Mendoza. That was the name engraved on the pale marble headstone, already worn by time and the constant rains that battered that lower part of the lot. The headstone was small, rectangular, with rounded edges and hand-carved floral details, as was common in children's burials of that era. The inscription stated that she died at age 9 in March of 2010. The cause of death was never recorded in the cemetery records, and strangest of all, there had never been an official family visit since the burial. No signatures, no names in the files, no requests for maintenance or cleaning. Julia was buried and forgotten, or so it seemed. When I asked my older colleagues if anyone often visited that grave, they laughed with that "here you come too" expression and told me that objects had been appearing there for years. But no one had ever seen who left them. They tried installing cameras, twice. The first time, the footage froze for 6 hours, even though the system was working normally in the rest of the cemetery. The second time, the footage showed only static at the exact moment the new toy appeared on the scene. The security technician said it was natural interference. But no one could explain why this only happened in front of Julia's grave. What bothered me most was the choice of objects. It wasn't just any old thing. They were vintage toys, packaging no longer manufactured, sweets I remembered from my childhood, and that was in the 1980s. One day, a blue teddy bear appeared, identical to the one my sister had when she was little. Same model, same stitching on the left ear. As if someone, or something, was choosing specific items to evoke recognition. And that's when I stopped laughing like everyone else. Because if it wasn't child's play, then maybe it was something no child should have access to. But what happened in the following nights made this theory seem almost comfortable, because there were signs coming from within the earth, and they began to respond. The first thing that made me stop trying to rationalize was the condition of the objects. One day, I found an open bag of candy on top of the tombstone. It was an old caramel candy wrapper, the kind wrapped in red paper with gold lettering, something you can't find in any supermarket anymore. But what caught my attention was the fact that they were all melted, completely deformed, as if they'd been exposed to the sun for hours. But that day, the sky had been cloudy since morning, and the temperature barely exceeded 14 degrees Celsius. The candy wrappers clung to the stone as if held together by something denser than sugar. And there, imprinted on the bottom of the wrapper, was the imprint of a small hand. Very small. The next day, a doll appeared. It was hand-sewn cloth, with button eyes and a little dress embroidered with purple. Thread. It was wet, soaking wet actually, even though there was no sign of rain or irrigation nearby. And when I lifted it to remove it from the headstone, I noticed its feet were covered in fresh dirt, as if it had been placed there after walking, or worse, after having left some place where dirt accumulates. It was that night that I first heard that sound that still gives me chills when I try to remember it. It was a muffled, low, childlike laugh. It didn't sound distant or echoing. It was close, too close. It came from behind one of the mausoleums that flanked the children's ward. When I went to check, there was nothing but shadow and silence. But the air there had that smell of old toys stored away too long. A bittersweet, stifling smell that doesn't belong anywhere alive. And from that moment on, the signs began to intensify. Scribbles appeared on the side wall of the sector. Small flowers plucked from the garden appeared next to the grave. And then the drawings began. Made in colored pencil, crooked, childlike lines, with 2 adults and a child holding hands, all faceless. But what was about to happen was nothing compared to any of that. Because that night, what awaited me, I was inside the earth, and I wasn't sleeping. That night the wind didn't move, the trees were still, as if time had stopped to observe what was about to happen. The air felt thicker, as if I were breathing through thick fabric, and each step I took made the ground creak strangely, as if something were down there, listening. I was walking through the children's ward after finishing my rounds when I noticed a faint glow coming from the direction of Julia's grave. A dim, yellowish light, flickering like a flashlight with a dead battery. I approached silently, unsure of what I would find, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The tomb's lid was slightly open. Not broken, not forced open, just ajar, as if someone had pushed from within. And there, lying in the fetal position, her face turned to the side, was a girl, or at least something that looked like a girl. The dress she wore was ancient, hand-embroidered, stained with mud and something dark, impossible to identify. Her skin was too pale to be natural, and her hair was plastered to her forehead from the damp. But what transfixed me was her face, or rather, its absence. Where her eyes should have been, there were only sunken, empty cavities, bloodless, motionless, as if they had been surgically removed long ago. She didn't move, didn't react to the flashlight. Beside her body was a small notebook with a light blue cover covered in dirt marks. I leafed through it with trembling hands, and what I found was even more disturbing. The pages were written in a childish, sloppy handwriting, with repeated phrases like "the light hurts," "I can't see," "Mommy said to sleep until they come back." On one of the last pages, a longer note: "I can't go out. If I go out, they won't like it. They're lying down now. But when it gets dark, they call." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but there was something in that presence, something that seemed to watch me even without eyes. And in that instant, it moved. Slowly, its head turned toward me, as if recognizing my hesitation. And that was when it spoke, and what she said was worse than anything I could have imagined. Her voice didn't come out as a whisper. It was clear, soft, and carried a tranquility that contrasted sharply with everything around her. She didn't seem scared, nor in pain. It was as if she were accustomed to being there, as if that space of stone, damp earth, and darkness were her room, her refuge, or her voluntary prison. He said my name without me having spoken. Then he smiled, not with his lips, but with his intonation. And he spoke again, with the same sweetness with which a child explains a secret of his own. "My parents live in the next tomb." I looked at the neighboring tomb, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill the entire cemetery. The headstone was intact, with no name engraved on it, just a rusty, slightly crooked cross. I tried to ask more, to understand what she was talking about, but she just settled herself in the coffin as if preparing for bed, and said matter-of-factly, "I can't leave here. If I do, they'll come after you." It ran through me like a slow iceberg creeping up my spine. It didn't feel like a threat. It was a realization, an ancient certainty, like someone who knows the rules of something. Much older than fear. They like it when I'm quiet, when I pretend I'm still dead. She touched the diary with her fingers and pointed to the tomb lid with her head. "Can you close it, please? It's almost time for them to wake up." And for some reason I still refused to understand. I obeyed. Slowly, without saying a word, I pulled the lid back and pushed it closed until the tomb was sealed again. And silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It seemed satisfied, as if, for one more night, the rules had been respected. The next day I arrived earlier than usual. The morning light gave the children's ward a more docile, almost harmless air. But I knew that appearance was deceiving. I walked to Julia's grave with the false hope that it had all been part of a freak-out, accumulated fatigue, or a lapse in my perception. But the lid was closed, intact, and upon it rested the blue bear I had removed days earlier, now clean, dry, and with a pink ribbon tied around its neck. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't touch the tomb again. I avoided that section for weeks, and the strangest thing was that no one asked me to look after that part of the cemetery anymore. It was as if everyone had suddenly forgotten that row of tombs existed. The toys continued to appear for a while, until they stopped completely. But when they stopped, something even stranger happened. The adjacent graves, previously sealed and unmarked, began to show signs of tampering. nail marks in the concrete, cracks in the edges of the flagstones, and one morning I found the cross lying askew on the grass, with 2 sets of footprints sunk into the wet earth. Large footprints, adult footprints, facing in the direction of Julia's grave. Since then, no one has patrolled that ward after sunset. No one enters, no one sweeps, no one dares speak of the eyeless girl. But sometimes, in the quietest of nights, I swear I still hear a soft knock on the chapel door. And the most disturbing thing is that it doesn't come alone. Because in the following account, what we find inside Tomb 219 shouldn't even exist, much less breathe. There are things we keep to ourselves, not out of fear, but out of concern that the simple act of telling them will bring them back to the surface. And in this case, I mean surface with all the meaning. I worked for years in a remote cemetery in rural Georgia, in a town most people don't even bother to locate on a map. The area was surrounded by dense forest, dirt hills, and abandoned train tracks, places where time seemed to slow down and then stop completely. Part of this cemetery had been closed off in 1983, officially due to subsidence, but everyone who worked there knew there was more. There's always more. Within this forgotten wing, overgrown with dense vegetation and rusting warning signs, lay one grave in particular. It bore no name, no date, no cross, just a bare concrete headstone, unmarked. And in place of the traditional lid, there was an iron coffin locked with 3 thick chains, as if someone were trying to keep the contents sealed at any cost. For 4 decades, no one dared get too close. But it wasn't until the chains began to vibrate at night that everyone realized it had never truly been empty. And perhaps most disturbing is what appeared around him afterward, because it wasn't just the chains that moved. It was the dates and the names, and all of them knew mine. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like so you don't miss the next dark stories. My name is Owen McNeil, and even after 30 years of working with death, I can count on one hand the times I've allowed myself to feel genuine fear. A gravedigger's routine isn't made up of sudden scares or cinematic apparitions. It's made up of silence, of waiting, of looking at the earth, knowing what it hides, and still digging. I've always been a skeptic, the kind who prefers to believe in structural flaws rather than ancient curses. And that's exactly why they put me back in that area of the cemetery. No one else wanted to go there. I began, discreetly investigating, reading through the administration's oldest files. Most of the documents related to the closed-off area were gone. Only a yellowed folder stood the test of time, coverless, almost forgotten in the back of a closet. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from 1951, folded in 4 and already faded. The headline reported a series of unexplained disappearances between February and April of that year, all involving residents living near the cemetery. The final paragraph mentioned a secret burial held without public attendance and without an official burial record. The description matched the unmarked tomb. The coffin's material, heavy wrought iron, sealed with symbols carved into the lid and reinforced with solid iron chains, was unusual. In fact, it wasn't permitted. No coffin of this kind should have been buried on public ground, especially without a marker, without identification, without ceremony. When I asked a long-time employee, he looked away and muttered something that chilled me to the core. The priest ordered it sealed. He said he needed to keep the soul at rest and the body away from the light. At the time, I still believed that it was all an exaggeration by people too old to distinguish memory from superstition. But when the first beat came, dry, deep, and rhythmic, I understood that time doesn't erase everything. Some things just wait, and then they start again. The first time I heard the sound, I thought I was imagining it. I was organizing a forgotten part of the warehouse when something in the rhythm of the night seemed to shift. It was as if the air grew denser, as if time itself began to slow down. And then came the knock. A dull, metallic sound, resonating 3 times, exactly 3 seconds apart. I glanced at my watch, 3:33 a.m., and at the same moment the backup generator swayed as if something had pulled it from the center of the earth. I returned to the isolation area the next day. During the day, nothing seemed out of place, but there were strange marks on the chain, not rust but scratches, as if something inside was trying to pull or push. I thought vandalism, a trapped animal, even ground shaking. But the following night, the knocking returned. 3 thuds. Silence. And then, the sound of chains stretching. This time I was closer, and I know what I heard. It was breathing, low, slow, sweeping, as if something inside that coffin was alive and waiting. On the 3rd day, I asked the night security guard for help, a robust, straightforward man, an army veteran. I didn't reveal the details, just said I needed a second opinion. He agreed to accompany me. We stood in silence on the sidelines of the closed-off field. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the knocking came, and then something else, a voice, deep, dry, murmuring a single word, repeated twice. "Owen, Owen." The security guard dropped his flashlight on the floor, walked away without a word, and never returned to his night shift. When I tried calling the next day, I was told he'd requested an immediate transfer, and that was when I realized whatever was in there knew my name. And worse, he knew I was listening. I just didn't know yet what he expected me to do, but that I would find out that very week, because I couldn't ignore what was about to happen. By the 4th day, the decision had been made. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the clock ticking as if each second were a countdown to something I had no idea how to control. At 2 in the morning, I grabbed the workshop's master key, an ancient relic used only to access sealed areas, and walked to the isolated section. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy, as if charged with electricity. The streetlights seemed dimmer, distorted by a haze that hadn't been there a minute before. Before the tomb, the chains were no longer secure. One of them had come loose on its own, as if pushed from within. I bent down and touched the cold. Iron. It was fresh. Someone or something had tampered. Using the tools, I loosened the remaining chains. The sound that echoed was dry, sharp, as if the metal had been freed from a promise made long ago. I hesitated for a few seconds, and then, with sweaty hands and my heart pounding in my throat, I pushed the coffin lid open. The sight hit me like a punch to the chest. Inside, lying with his hands crossed over his chest, was a man, not a corpse, a living man, wrinkled skin as thin as old. On paper, but pink and pulsing. His eyes, completely black, were open, motionless, fixed on me with a serenity that froze me. And even without moving a muscle, I knew he was conscious. He knew exactly who I was. The smell inside was sweet, strange, like melted candle smoke mixed with wet earth. And in the corner of the coffin rested a lit candle, spent, flickering, but alive. The wick burned even without oxygen, even without logic. On the old man's body, marks, symbols carved directly into the skin, like scars made with a hot iron. I recognized some. They were of pagan origin, but there were others I'd never seen before. No sound was made, no words spoken. He just moved his fingers slowly and handed me a yellowed envelope. Inside it was something that would freeze what little reason I had left that night. It was a photograph, and what was in it changed everything. With trembling hands, I removed the photo from the envelope. It was yellowed with age, with frayed edges and moisture stains at the corners. However, the image was still clear enough to leave me completely speechless. It was awake. The room was small, simple, decorated with dried flowers and candles arranged around a closed coffin. Around it, 3 people stood. A priest, a woman in a black veil, and me. Or at least someone exactly like me. Same build, same pronounced jaw, same slightly bent gaze toward the ground, as if trying to understand what I was doing there. I turned the photo over, and on the back was a handwritten sentence in faded ink. "See you in 72 years. The date in the bottom corner read April 17th, 1951. My mind didn't know how to react. It was as if 2 threads of time were intertwined there in my hands, without asking logic's permission. I tried to think of a setup, a coincidence, a psychological trick, but when I looked up at the man inside the coffin, he was still there. He was still staring at me with his dark eyes and a faint smile, as if he already knew exactly how it would all end. It was at that moment that the candle went out, without wind, without sound, just a dry snap, as if something had been shut down or sealed. And when I looked again at the bottom of the coffin, it was empty. The next morning, I returned to the tomb, accompanied by 2 administration officials. I took with me the flashlight, the envelope, and a desperate attempt to find some rational explanation for what I had witnessed. When we arrived, the coffin was resealed. The chains had been replaced, secured with a new padlock, and there were no signs of tampering. But the most frightening thing was that when we opened it, there was absolutely nothing inside. No body, no candle, no marks, only emptiness. A metallic hole covered by the densest silence I had ever felt in my life. I mentioned the photo. I tried to show it, but the envelope that had been in my pocket was gone. I rummaged through everything. I checked my clothes. I went back to the workshop. I retraced every step. Nothing. As if it had never existed, or worse, as if I had never been allowed to show it. That same afternoon, I accessed the city records again, trying to cross-reference dates, names, any reference to the 1951 wake. And it was then that I found, in the bottom corner of a scanned document, a handwritten attendance list. At the bottom of the list, my name, Owen McNeil, signed in the same handwriting I still use today, with the same date, the same year, the same event. Since that night, I haven't slept. Completely, and sometimes when the clock strikes 3:33, I feel someone behind me. I don't hear footsteps, I don't see shadows, but I feel the eyes, those eyes, the same ones that once faded, but never stopped seeing me. And if you think that's the end, you haven't seen what's locked in the central ossuary, door number 7, the one that, according to records, has only been opened once, from the inside. I never imagined my first day working in a cemetery could feel so wrong, and I'd done everything in my life, but this was different. The opening came through a distant uncle, a long-time employee of a newly opened cemetery in rural Indiana. It was a growing area with new lots, dirt paths, and overly clean graves, devoid of flowers, devoid of history, as if death was still learning to inhabit the place. I was assigned to Sector 6, the newest and most isolated part, far from the main building. And the old wings where the historic tombs were located. There was a thick silence there. Not even the birds seemed inclined to fly overhead. Everything seemed new and at the same time out of place. My colleagues gave me a map, some basic instructions and little else. But what struck me most was their behavior as the afternoon drew in. At 4:40 p.m., everyone began to quicken their pace, gather their tools, abandon tasks half finished as if obeying an invisible, almost sacred schedule. I asked one of the older workers if it was because of the cold that began to set in at the end of the day, and he simply replied, without even looking me in the eye, "After 5. No one stays in the new sector." That seemed exaggerated, even funny. But when the same man passed me shortly afterward, muttering as if reciting an ancient warning, "Grave 214, stay away," the tone of the conversation changed. It was as if he were trying to warn me but didn't have the courage to spell out what was there. The number echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. Grave 214. On the map, the tomb was right in the center of the new sector, surrounded by still empty graves. And as much as I tried to ignore it, something in that whispered recommendation began to eat away at me. I needed to understand what was happening there. But everything inside me told me the answer wouldn't come easily, and even less safely. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare me for what I would. See that afternoon, because at 5 p.m. sharp, she appeared. If stories like this resonate with you, subscribe to the channel now and leave a like so you don't miss the next dark stories. Just as my wristwatch vibrated, signaling 5 in the afternoon, a cold wind, completely unseasonable, swept through the new section with a biting speed, stirring up dry leaves I'd never seen before. The sky, which had been clear until then, began to cloud over within minutes, as if a storm were approaching. Exclusively for that part of the cemetery, and it was at that precise moment, with the hair on my arms standing on end and my stomach clenching, that I saw it for the first time. Among the newer headstones, right in the row of Tomb 214, a silhouette stood out. It was a woman. Her back was turned. She wore an antique black dress, as if she'd just emerged from a burial from the last century. Her long dark hair fell perfectly straight over her shoulders, and what most paralyzed me was the stillness of her body. She didn't move. No tremor, no adjustment of posture, just standing there, staring fixedly at a headstone that, at that moment, I still couldn't identify. I considered calling out, coughing loudly, shuffling my foot on the gravel, just to see if she noticed me, but something inside me, something I'd never felt before, stopped me. It wasn't fear in the ordinary sense. It was as if my entire body was on high alert, urging me not to break the moment, not to interfere. The atmosphere around me seemed denser, as if the very air there was heavier. And then, slowly, she turned her face away. I'll never forget that look. Her eyes held no human expression. They were sunken, opaque, as if immersed in another time, another reality. And even from a distance, I had the distinct feeling that she recognized me, not that she knew me from somewhere, but that she knew exactly who I was, what I was doing there, and even what I'd felt since I'd set foot in that cemetery. It gave me a sudden urge, an urge to run without looking back, but I didn't move, and I wouldn't have had time, because in the next instant, she disappeared. And along with her, what I would find on that tombstone would become the greatest mystery of my life. As soon as the figure vanished into thin air, as if blown away by the wind, my legs finally obeyed the impulse I'd been suppressing until then. I walked hesitantly to the exact spot where she'd stood. The ground there seemed colder, more humid, almost as if I were breathing a different temperature. The smell of wet earth was stronger, denser, almost suffocating, and there, right in front of me, was the tombstone. But what stuck in my throat wasn't the name. It was precisely its absence. The headstone was completely intact, new, free of moss, free of dust, but without any name engraved on it. No date, no flowers, no portrait, just the smooth stone, as if it had been placed there recently, waiting for something, or someone. For a moment, I thought it might be a recording error, an as-yet unidentified grave or a recent exhumation, but when I bent down to touch the stone, I noticed something very discreetly engraved on the base, almost imperceptible. A single word, carved with such fine precision, it looked as if it had been hand-carved with something extremely sharp. Your back. There was nothing beyond that. Just that loose, ambiguous and deeply disturbing word. Have I returned? Who? To where? And why? At that moment, a distant memory surfaced, a story I'd heard from an old gravedigger who'd worked there before me and who'd disappeared without a trace. Rumor had it, he'd refused to maintain the new section of the cemetery. He always claimed the area was incomplete. At the time, no one paid any attention. But now, in that silence that seemed to scream inside my head, I began to understand what he meant. The tombstone wasn't empty. It just wasn't for the living. And it was at that moment that the radio clipped to my belt, which was turned off, squeaked on its own, releasing a muffled whisper I'd never heard before. It wasn't interference. It was a voice. And what she said still echoes in my mind today, and worse. She seemed to know exactly what I was about to discover in the following nights. At that moment, my entire body froze. The sound didn't come loudly, nor suddenly. It came like a cursed breath from within the switched-off radio, a wet hiss, almost as if it was submerged in water, but within it there was something, a whispered voice, and it wasn't just any voice, it was familiar. For a moment, I refused to accept what I was hearing. I thought it was a trick of the mind, a reflection of the fear already gripping me. But as I approached the radio, still silent, turned off with no lights on, the hissing sound came again. And this time, it came more clearly. It was my name, not shouted, not begged, but whispered, as if someone were calling me from within the earth. "Leandro!" the voice drawled, as if trying to speak with a mouth full of earth, and then immediately after a complete sentence fragmented by the hiss. "You shouldn't have come back here." My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst through my vest. It took my breath away. I instinctively took 2 steps back and leaned against something cold. It wasn't a tree or a tombstone. It was a statue, one of those statues that had never been there before, at least not in this part of the cemetery. An angelic figure, its face broken but its eyes perfectly intact, staring at me as if it had just witnessed my mistake, as if I had awakened something. I didn't have the courage to turn the radio over to see if it was working or not. I put it in my pocket without looking, almost as if I feared confirming that this wasn't just me having a fit, but something real, something that involved me in a way much deeper than I could understand. Because in that moment, a memory struck me like an icy blade. The same voice, the same words had been heard before, years ago, by the former gravedigger. He too heard his name. He too walked away from the new wing. And after the 3rd time he was called, he disappeared forever. And now, it was my turn to be called, but whatever was calling me didn't just want to talk. After the hissing, I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. I stepped away from the statue, but it seemed to be following me with its eyes, even without moving. There was something wrong with this place, and with the way time seemed distorted around me. Minutes passed like hours, and everything seemed suspended in a tense silence, as if the air itself were holding its breath. My steps, once steady, now became slow, shuffling, as if the ground were heavier, or as if the cemetery no longer wanted to let me leave. That's when my eyes fell on something I swear I'd never seen there before. A simple, low, isolated headstone covered in a thin layer of dry leaves and moss. The strangest thing, it wasn't on the internal map the staff used to record burials. I knew every space in that cemetery, every grave, every name. But this one belonged to nothing. And most disturbing, there was no name, no date, no inscription. Just the mark of a hand-carved cross. Imperfect, almost as if it had been made in a hurry or in desperation. I moved closer, against my instincts, feeling my throat tighten and my stomach churn. The dry leaves began to move around me even though there was no wind. The air was still, but something stirred. When I touched the stone, a cold rush ran up my hand to my neck. It was then that I heard the same voice as before, clearer, closer. And it wasn't coming from the radio. She came from under the ground. "Leandro, see me, please." The voice. She was crying. Not screams, not threats. It was a sad plea, like someone unjustly buried, like someone forgotten by everyone, or worse, buried alive. I staggered. Away, my heart racing, and for the first time in my life, I considered abandoning my shift, running away, leaving everything behind. But something inside me wanted to know more, wanted to understand, because that tombstone, that voice, that whisper coming from the ground, seemed to know exactly who I was. And the craziest thing is that, from then on, I would begin to discover that that tomb perhaps had a direct connection to my past, to something I had hidden even from myself. I returned home that morning carrying more than dark circles and fatigue. I carried a bitter feeling that I had awakened something that had been dormant, not just in the cemetery, but within myself. Throughout the day, I tried to return to my routine, pretend everything was fine, that the previous night hadn't happened. But all I had to do was close my eyes for a few seconds, and there it was, the voice, the whisper, the sad plea coming from the earth. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself. It was exhaustion, or some trick my mind was playing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next night I gathered my courage and brought a flashlight, my radio, and a small notebook. I returned to the same spot, to that unmarked headstone, only this time, it wasn't there. The earth had been disturbed. There were fresh marks, as if someone had dug and then hurriedly tried to cover it up. The moss, the leaves, they were different. It was as if the cemetery had breathed, as if something had moved. The chill down my spine was no longer psychological, it was physical. My entire body shivered at the absence of that headstone. It had been there yesterday, but now it was as if it had never existed. And then, the next morning, something even more disturbing. On my mirror, in the steam from my shower, a name appeared, written in fine lines, as if an invisible finger had drawn it. A name I didn't recognize, but one that moved me deeply. A name that seemed buried not in a tomb, but in my own memory. From that moment on, I realized this story was far from over. What I began to unravel that early morning was only the surface of something much older, much more personal, and infinitely more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. And if you think what's happened so far is disturbing, wait until you hear what I learned in the following account, when I received a mysterious call from a private number with the exact voice of the woman buried in that tombstone. The story she told me will leave you speechless. If you've made it this far, it's because you sensed that this story isn't just another tale. And perhaps, like me, you're beginning to realize that some souls won't rest until the truth comes to light. So stay tuned. Subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell so you don't miss the sequel, and join me in the next video, because there are buried secrets that cannot and will not remain silent.